But I'm joined today by Nick Watts, who's wrote an interesting book called Taxation is Slavery. And I highly recommend that people pick up this book. It raises some very interesting questions. But Nick, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and why did you write such a fascinating book?
Yeah, sure. That's a gee bit of a story. So yeah, my name's Nick. I live on the Gold Coast of Australia. It's normally very warm here, but right now it's the dead of winter, and I live kind of up a mountain, so hence snow jacket. Doing this interview from our garage where it's not insulated and it's properly cold. So that's where I'm coming to you from. I have a lovely wife and three kids, about to have kid number four any day now. And I wrote Taxation is Slavery because I couldn't not write it. Uh, a few years back, I went and did Bible college in Brisbane at QTC, Queensland Theological College for the nerds. And at the time, I was interested in maybe pursuing politics as like trying to be a Christian in the political scene and see if I could do something useful for the gospel in kind of public policy. I was thinking about guys like William Wilberforce and these kind of people that had moved nations in a good direction, and thought maybe there's something there that I could do. And I decided I had to do a capstone project for my master's degree, where I just spent 6 months deep diving on a topic and wrote one really, really long essay, sort of like a thesis type thing, but not quite as huge scope as that sort of idea. Um, so I decided I would write something in that politics space, and I was looking for a topic that would get me into the nitty gritty of it, and I decided on taxes because I thought it's such a finely tuned thing. Should the tax rate be 20%, 21%, 20.5%, you could dial it in so fine. I thought if I can find the principles that let me have a good answer to that kind of question, what would I make the tax rate if I was a politician? Then those principles should be able to be applied elsewhere and just help me have a good framework for thinking about politics as a Christian. And so I started doing the research on that. Uh, I framed it all around the thought of a guy named Abraham Kuyper, if people have heard of him. So he was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands in gee, I should remember the year, but I don't remember what year. I think it was early 1900s, pre-World Wars. Um, he was a Calvinist theologian, but also the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And so I thought, if anyone has kind of thought this through at length and in detail, it's probably this guy. That's probably who I need to go to understand his thought. So I did deep dive on that, read all the commentators, and it just started me down this rabbit hole that led to reading a lot of economics, a lot of kind of political philosophy, and this kind of thing. And by the time I'd come out the other end of just months and months of reading Christian politics, I had a completely different set of views on it when I started. And I still had to try and write this essay that I now thought it's framed all wrong. I'm never going to, the answer I have to give, the question is framed in such a way that there's no right answer. So I still had to write the essay to answer the question I had proposed to answer in my sort of thesis proposal. So I did that, but I then had all this research material that I had nothing left to do with. So I thought I have to put this into a book, and so I'm just going to write the book that I wish had been in the library when I started all this. And so that is what I did. It took another couple of years, but eventually published it. And yeah, it was a labor of love, not something I expected that many other people to read. Just a handful of nerds, and a surprising number of people have picked it up.
Well, it certainly raises some interesting questions I think more Christians need to think about. We can take things for granted. What is tax and should we pay tax? The thing is these are really good questions that we need to raise in our day and age. Now, the sort of meme of taxation is theft, which I really think your book is kind of taken up to another level with taxation is slavery, was actually a term I actually first heard coined not by libertarians but by theonomists. So postmillennial theonomists were kind of going taxation as slavery. And I remember when I first encountered this thing, well, it doesn't sound biblical, and the Bible clearly says to pay your taxes. So um, I know maybe introduce your sort of background in terms of where you stand now. Are you a theonomist, or are you coming from a different perspective?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm a theonomist, but I would say that I find it very easy to be friendly with theonomists. I have a bunch of people that I went through college with were big fans of Greg Barnson and that whole kind of post-mill presuppositional kind of school of Reformed theology and that kind of scene. So that was popular amongst my peers at college, and sort of sympathetic to a lot of things they say, but not with them on everything exactly. So I sort of think of them as like fellow travelers, but not exactly in the same camp as me. I'm coming at it from more of a kind of Mises, Rothbard, ANCAP kind of direction. So I would describe myself as an anarcho-capitalist. So I believe in actually privatizing literally everything. Having no government at all would be the ideal, for reasons we can get into if you want. I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, but I still think of that as the ideal that we would like to get closer to, is literally having no state. So not no governance. There should be governance and order in the society, but it shouldn't be done by violence. Is basically the essence of it.
So would you define that as anarchy?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would tend to be careful of using the word anarchy. There's historically it has this connotation of being associated with, there are kind of right anarchists and left anarchists. There are anarcho-capitalists and what are called anarcho-communists or anarcho-syndicalists. And historically, the term anarchist has tended to refer to anarcho-syndicalists who believe in like collective ownership, and they somehow think they're going to have everything be publicly owned, but there's no government to administer it. And I don't think it works at all. But that's kind of what the term anarchy has been associated with. And when you think of like anarchy in the UK and those kind of means, like that's what they're talking about. So I would use the term anarchist in a technical sense when I'm talking to people who don't understand what I mean. When I'm talking to kind of the person on the street who's less likely to know exactly what I'm referring to, I'll tend to use a term like voluntarist, because I think that gets to the heart of the matter. I think society should be based on voluntary interactions, and interactions people have with the state are involuntary. They show up and say, "Give us your money, or we're going to send you to jail, or put you in house arrest, or we'll take it straight out of the bank, or some other involuntary interaction." Um, so yeah, voluntary society is really what I think is a biblical ideal.
Okay. Yeah, that's important because I think when you say anarchist to Christians, I think they associate with lawlessness, and that's not what you're saying. You're not saying that there
Yeah,
should be lawlessness.
not
I
at all.
think it's also associated with atheism, right? Because if there's no God, there's no authority, and there's no one to tell me what to do. I can do whatever I want, and therefore, no human society has a right to tell me what to do. So anarchy, I think, or lawlessness is the kind of natural progression of atheistic philosophy. Is that, well, it's
Yeah,
might makes right, and no one really has an obligation for me to follow the law, pay taxes. I kind of just do it because I'm fear of the consequences, really. So I think that's an important distinction for Christians to know who are listening to this. When the term anarchy is being used here, as you said, it's been used in a slightly different term than might appear to people at first.
yeah, yeah. It's very true, and I think you're right. Atheism does lead to a sort of lawless, libertine kind of society. But then the irony is that that quickly gives way to someone rising up as the dictator. Whoever is the strongest ends up
Yeah.
controlling everything. And
Yeah.
so,
Well,
yeah,
I go as far as to say I think there's an active agenda to promote lawlessness in society because with this created problem you can then bring in your active solution, which is bigger government, more top-down control. So I do think that's part of an agenda to lower the moral standards of the populations so that big government can come in and rescue the people from themselves. In fact, there's an interesting book, I don't know if you have read this, and I would highly recommend that you do. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy. You know it's serious when you've got the eye in the
yeah,
pyramid. But it's Proofs of the Conspiracy by John Robinson. And this was a gentleman who sort of traveled Europe, the continent, around the 1700s and visiting various Masonic lodges. And he was convinced that a lot of these Masonic lodges, which I think a lot of them were just gentlemen clubs, had really been taken over by a sinister, seditious group known as the Bavarian Illuminati. So that's where all these memes come from. But it actually comes from
mm,
this book, and there is a historical basis for this seditious group that came out of Bavaria. The king weeded them out, and he argues that they didn't cease; they just dispersed, and they kind of spread across Europe, eventually going to France and starting the French Revolution. And their agenda, their goal, was to bring in a universal totalitarian state in which there was the abolition of the monarchy, the abolition of the church, and abolition of fathers. And when I look at secular societies, what do we see? Well, we see an abolition of the monarchy, we see the abolition of the church, at least in its influence, and then the abolition of fathers to things like feminism. So yeah, we really see the replacement of kings with secularism, which is kind of government, the replacement of the church with activism, and then the replacement of fathers with feminism. So I see this agenda played out. Like this book has said things, was happening 30 years ago, and lo and behold, we now are reaping the fruits of that ideology. So I would classify myself in terms of my sort of political leanings, not as a theonomist, because I think that the theonomists make the mistake by conflating church and state, and I think they say that the church must usher in a a government that enacts Christian laws, which I don't see that in scripture. I think Jesus explicitly says, if my kingdom was of this world, my people would fight and they would win. Like if Christianity was really about through the sword conquering, we would have conquered the world by now. It would have happened in the first generation because Christ is unstoppable. Um, so, but I do recognize that God establishes all governments. And I think, you would have the same idea that everything is under God's sovereign hand and will. He raises up governments. He brings them down, whether they're democracies, so called, or whether they're monarchies or anarchies, or whatever kind of governments they are. So I do think that there are better types of government, certainly, and I think there's Christian government and non-Christian government, and I think the finest Christian governments are manifested in monarchies. I do think so. I would be pro monarchy, not necessarily pro. I'm not a royalist. I wouldn't be pro the British royal
Can I
so-called monarchy.
can I ask you just to make that distinction a bit more clear for me? Because not being from a country that has a monarchy, I'm actually not really sure what's the distinction between a monarchist and a royalist.
Well, a royalist would be loyal to the royal family, whilst I wouldn't even classify the royal family as a monarchy because they don't meet the definitions biblically of a monarch. The monarch has to have the ability to put criminals to the sword. King Charles does not have that ability, so he's not a monarch. It's like if you get a lion and you defang the lion, you take the claws out of the lion, you neuter the lion, and then you sedate the lion. You say, "Look at my lion." It's like, well, it's a lion in name only at this point, and it doesn't lack the ferocity that the King of Judah is supposed to emanate, which is to be a terror to evil works. A king should be terrifying, and this is why in Proverbs, Solomon says that a king scatters evil with his eyes when he sits on his throne, and that's because when a king sits on his throne, he has the authority to put people to death who do evil. So that would probably be the biggest distinction. Is really just trying to focus on a biblical definition of monarchy. So uh, my sort of position is pray for kings, pray for Christian government. I think we even commanded to do this in Timothy, right? Paul tells Timothy to pray for kings because God desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. The kind of encouragement to Timothy there is pray for people in authority, rulers, because God can elect to save them. It's not that God only came for the poor and the weak and the vulnerable. He sure did, but God could also sovereignly ordain that a king like Nebuchadnezzar becomes saved and that the nation becomes transformed. So I think there is a sort of emphasis to pray for kings. And then the question arises, well, if the king does become converted, what does the nation look like? What kind of laws do they pass? So I'm probably more of that flavor of, so I don't think that Christians should, storm the castle, take up arms and overthrow the government. So I would be quite critical of things like the British Civil War. For example, I don't think they should have put Charles the First to the sword, even though he was a Catholic bringing in heresy. There's a preference to have Christian monarchs over secular governments, and I think ultimately wisdom is justified by her children. We see atheism applied to governance. We just have to look to the USSR. That failed political system collapsed within a generation. That's how idiotic that ideology is. Christian monarchy in the United Kingdom was manifested for generations, and I would argue led to some of the greatest developments in human history and progress, true progress, not the kind of just the name that's been associated with it. So that's the flavor I'm coming from. So I think we probably have a lot that we agree with, but maybe we have some disagreements. So I figured it would be good to just jump on this call and to kind of flesh out some of those ideas. And if nothing else, hopefully raise some questions that people listening can certainly think, actually, what is biblical government and what is the role of the church and the role of the state? And what is tax? And so, if nothing else, I just hope that this will kind of spur people to answer these questions and get into the scriptures and investigate this.
Sounds good.
So, one thing you mentioned in your book is that the first time king is used is in reference to Nimrod. And Nimrod obviously was one of the first kind of city creators, and his most famous city, Babel, in the plains of Shinar, has a famous history of leading to basically the first tyrant. And one thing that I find Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book, Leviathan. I don't know if you've read. It's kind of a pro-monarchy book.
I haven't read
Thomas
it. No.
Hobbes was
I'm aware
he
of it,
was
but I haven't
a
read it.
yeah, he was a British political figure. And one thing he argues in his book, so what's the difference between a tyrant and a king? And he basically argues that, well, the king is when you like him, like the guy in charge. The tyrant is when you don't like him. That's pretty much the only difference. And if you like the king, he's always the king. And if you don't like him, well, he's a tyrant. So it's kind of like terrorists or freedom fighters. If you're kind of sympathetic to their cause, oh, they're freedom fighters. But if you're not, they're terrorists. So it's a similar sort of concept. So yeah, Nimrod, I would argue, I agree with you, he's the first tyrant, but I wouldn't say he's the first king. And I think in the scriptures,
Yeah.
there's always this duality of leadership, right? There's always, I think, a picture of Jesus as the true, righteous, proper king, and then a picture of Satan, who is the illegitimate tyrant king, who eventually will be manifested on the earth in the presence of the Antichrist. So I think we see this throughout the scripture. So you see Saul, and I think you rightly point out in your book that Saul is kind of elected by the people because they reject God as king, and they kind of, hey, we want this as our king, like they rejected Christ, right? We'll have no king for us other than Caesar. They reject the Messiah, and they are now going to eventually accept the worthless shepherd, as it says in Zechariah 11. And then you have, just opposed to Saul, King David, and King David is very much unlike Saul. Saul he's described as being taller than anyone else, and David is described as being kind of puny, uh, and one who's after God's own heart. So I think we sort of have these constant contrasts between good and bad kings in the scriptures, and I think there's a sort of greater cosmological picture that God is painting in the scriptures. So I think in your book, you've put a lot of focus on the elements of monarchy, which are actually descriptions of the Antichrist. And maybe there is a lack of focus on the kind of qualities of the monarchs, which actually bring more of an emphasis to the rule of Christ as monarch.
Yeah, I think potentially so. I think something. I'm not sure if I put this in the book towards the end. I think I might have put it in there. I'm trying to recall. But as I was putting it together, my kind of working title for it was actually Divine Monarchy rather than Taxation
Okay.
Slavery. That was I was trying to come up with a label for this sort of political philosophy, this way of looking at how politics should be as a Christian. And the best I could come up with was divine monarchy because I was trying to distinguish it from theocracy, which because
Yes.
I think the term theocracy is a bit loaded because people think of like an Islamic theocracy
Yes.
and like it tends to in
Or
practice
Calvin's
be
theocracy.
yeah, these kind of things. And so what I really was trying to get at is we want Christ to be king.
Yeah, so theocratic monarchy, I think, is the term that I've would coin,
Yeah,
where
interesting.
you have God as king. So, would you agree with the statement "No king but Christ"? I know that is a sort of common meme that's also thrown out there.
I would say that. I have a t-shirt that says that and I wear it every time I have to go to the voting booth.
Okay. Yeah.
We have compulsory voting in Australia. You can't just not vote. They send you
Oh,
fines and
okay.
things. So
Oh gosh.
it's a have to go. So I wear a t-shirt that says "No King but Christ."
Well, Australia is also known to be the best breakdancers in the world, so you got that on your side.
Oh, that's low.
Well, I actually think that breakdancing routine was a perfect kind of symbol of the establishment that rejects Christ as king. Like, this is what your worldview looks like. You think you're cool, you think you're trendy, but
Completely
this is
ridiculous.
what this is how your philosophy actually plays out. So it was actually quite useful, I think, as that tool. So yeah, I actually disagree with that term, "No Christ as king," and I'll
Yeah,
tell you why. I
later.
think it's one of those things that sounds really good at first, and then like the more you think about it, it's like, actually, wait, hang on a second. First of all, it's this kind of slogan of the Scottish Covenanters during the British Civil War, when they kind of ousted Charles I, and
Did
then they
not know
killed him.
that. That's good
And that's
context.
that's really the beginning of, I think that's technically recticide, the killing of a king. I think the Bible condemns. So I don't think they were justified in killing the king. Um, And then I think when you say "No king but Christ," it obviously comes from when the Jews rejected Christ. We have no king but Caesar. So they kind of invert that, saying we have no king but Christ. And it kind of sounds really zealous. But I would argue that Jesus is the King of Kings, which presupposes the legitimacy of other kings. So I think that Jesus is the King of Kings. So the term "no king but Christ" sort of undermines his authority as king over other kings. So that's why I disagree with that, even though I sort of agree with the overall sentiment that, and I certainly agree with the ending of your book. I think this is probably where we have the strongest agreement, where we both don't we both believe that politics isn't going to make Christian nations. I
Mhm.
think it's Christian nations make good politics, not the other way around. And that king and the king of the nations needs to be Christ. And in fact, in the Republic of Ireland on paper is technically a theocracy. It's technically a theocratic monarchy. It says at the beginning of its constitution that Christ is the King of Ireland and that no law shall be passed that does not correspond to the morals of Christ. So, you could technically argue on the basis of that the current government in Ireland is illegitimate and the Christians don't have to submit to them. So I actually think this is a stronger argument for not paying taxes. Um, maybe we can get into this, but I think we could probably look at certain governments and saying, well, biblically speaking, you don't even meet the criteria for government itself, because the goal of government really has two jobs: is to punish evil doing and to promote good doing. And when we have governments that call good evil and evil good, well, you no longer meet the definition of government, and therefore I no longer have to submit to you. So I think that's probably a stronger argument, in my opinion, of not paying taxes. Like, you're not even government. You're just like LARPing. Like you're role playing at this point. You're not actually a government.
Have you ever come across an essay called "The Myth of the Rule of Law" by John Hasnas?
No.
That's I think it's freely available. I think you just find it online. But it's one of these things that I read, and in my heart I resisted it. I read it and went, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. I don't like the conclusion he's taking me to. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that's he's right. I don't like that he's right, but he's totally right. Yeah. The gist of it is basically it's a bit of a difficult thing to summarize. I think it's really an argument for what's called legal realism, so that what the law is what is enforced. What it fundamentally means is that the state is going to do what it's going to do, and arguments that you make against that, however rational they sound, are pretty meaningless. They're going to do what they want to do, and they'll find a justification for it after the fact. And there are enough laws on the books that contradict each other that they can pick and choose and come to any conclusion they want by just selecting or making even by making bad arguments, because they don't need to be right. They don't need to have an actual logical syllogism that's valid and makes it. They don't need any of that. They just need the not even the consent of the public, but the sort of the acquiescence of the public. They just need the public to go, it's inevitable or it's not worth resisting, and they get their way. So I had to have this conversation with a friend who, because he knew I'd done a lot of thinking about these kind of topics, and he was very interested in like the sovereign citizen thing. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but people kind of making arguments to the police that certain laws that the police are trying to enforce are not valid, and here's all the clever arguments for why that law shouldn't be considered a real law, and this kind of thing. And of course, they get fined anyway. And the point I basically made to him was, look, it doesn't matter how clever your arguments are. Like, they don't care whether you're right. Just they have a gun and you don't at the end of the day,
Hmm.
and they're going to do what they want to do, whether it's fair or makes sense or not. And I think once I understand what the state is through that lens, that it is violence and force. Or as Rothbard would have put it, it is that institution in society that maintains a monopoly on violence in a given territorial area. That is, and he used the term the state on purpose to distinguish from the idea of government or the idea of a king or a president, because in theory, you could have a king, or what you might even call, like on a smaller scale, a tribal chief who doesn't operate by violence, who actually is in charge because there's a profound respect in the community and the society for his judgment or his position, and he actually doesn't need to operate by threatening anyone with violence. That is quite possible, especially on a smaller scale. You can definitely imagine like a small tribal group where there's one or more elders who people just respect their opinions so strongly that they will do what they say and give them the scope to govern, even without them having to actually threaten anyone with violence. Uh, so, in that sense, I think it's quite possible to have kings in that sense who are under Christ and who are legitimate. Where I think it becomes illegitimate is where they start governing by force.
Okay. Well, we actually have a historical example of this. I know that in your book, and uh, this would probably be another area where I disagree. You talk about William of Orange, who came in, but one reason why it's called the Glorious Revolution is because there was no bloodshed. There was so much overwhelming support for him to be king that when he met James II's army in battle, there were so many defectors to the other side that James had to flee into Europe. And there was basically no king because he wasn't brought over to be king. He was brought over to mediate through force. You know, he has an army. You know, that's
Mm,
you can't just bully us out of here with your army. We're going to bring in another army to kind of mediate. He took the throne. It's called the Glorious Revolution because it really was an act of God. There was no violence. There was no battle, and it's so you'd have historical examples of things like this exactly happening where you have a tyrant who comes in, he wants to bring back Roman oppression and bring them basically back under the global system of the day. Like, no, 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 we quite enjoy having the liberties that we've had and this Protestant theology governing our law and our land. And there was just so I think that's the idea of like monarchs, right? There's no such thing as an absolute monarch. And back to your point, yes, you could technically have a tyrant who just kills whoever he wants, but he lands up like Joseph Stalin, and his kingdom falls within a generation. And
mm,
I think that's inevitably happens with evil. Evil is always self-destructive. Christianity doesn't destroy evil, just outlasts it. Christianity has just endured the Roman Empire's endured the evil of the generations and outlasts it because it's the truth.
yeah, yeah,
And
very
to
true.
go back to go back to the kind of like the pro-monarchy books, there's a book called Patriarcha by Robert Filmer. And one thing that he argues in the book is that one of the benefits of a monarchy is that you know who injures you. So if you have some
Mm,
other governments, it can be very difficult to suss out who's to blame. Like if taxes are too high or the roads are a mess, like who do you blame? Well, it's in a monarchy, it's the king's fault. It's easy. It's quite transparent in that way. So if there is tyranny, it's very easy to spot that tyranny. Whilst if it's kind of mass behind, you know, NGOs and corporations and some nepotism, and it's very difficult to work out who's to actually blame. So I think that's another advantage of monarchy over whatever kind of crazy system the godless cook up at this point.
I am very sympathetic to the idea that monarchy is preferable to democracy or to these other kind of you know I wouldn't say decentralized, but I guess I would just say diffuse forms of government where there's just a lot of people involved and a lot of sort of bureaucracy. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that monarchy is more effective than those things are, and for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, well, that's in Patriarcha. He argues exactly that monarchy is preferable to democracy because if you're coming from Christian presuppositions, you believe in total depravity, you believe that man is not innately good, so you want to
Mm,
restrain the evil of the majority, not give them authority. So the goal is that you centralize power to those who are righteous and those who are capable and competent. You don't give it to the masses who are by and large immoral. So that was one of his arguments, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of the role of righteous kings on the kind of populations.
yeah, I think there's the difficulty. It cuts both ways, I think, because when you have a good king, it's great, but when you have an evil king, it goes real bad real fast.
Yes.
Whereas I think the having a parliament kind of slows it down in both directions. Makes the ship turn more slowly, which is good when you have bad people in charge, and annoying when you have people who really want to do good reforms. Think about like Javier Milei, who's trying to reform Argentina, and it's taken a while because he's not in absolute power, and there's a lot of good things he'd like to do, and it's tricky, by contrast to a king can get in and just start changing things at will. And can I ask if it's not too personal a question, if you'd rather not say on the podcast, I understand. But what's your kind of denominational background?
Oh, wow. I don't. It's complex. Well, I actually grew up in
Yeah.
Pentecostal churches, so
Oh, really?
my grandparents would have been Church of England,
Hmm.
and they went more charismatic Pentecostal. So I grew up in Pentecostal churches, but as I grew up, I went more Reformed. So technically now a Reformed Baptist. So that's sort of where I sit now. So I kind of feel like I've had a taste of everything at this
Yeah.
point. So I've had a wide range of Christian experience, from Anglican to I've been in Presbyterian churches, I've been in Reformed Baptist churches and Assemblies of
I,
God. So I've had a wide mix of denominational backgrounds. What about yourself?
I'm pretty similar actually.
Okay.
So the school I went to for primary and high school was mostly Pentecostal. It's a Christian school, but mostly Pentecostal, and hung out mostly in Presbyterian and Anglican churches. I'm a Credo Baptist by conviction, and so technically a Reformed Baptist. But there are very, very few Reformed Baptist churches in Australia. That's like the ones I know of,
Okay.
I could count on one hand. So there's just an awful lot of closet Baptists hanging out in Presbyterian church here, and there are pockets of Anglicans that are Reformed and conservative and 39 articles and all that good stuff. And particularly in Sydney, there's a big contingent of those. But once you get out of Sydney and out of the kind of few satellite areas of Sydney, the Anglicans are pretty kind of left liberal.
Okay.
It's just one of those things that I did like a ministry apprenticeship in that kind of conservative Anglican context, and so I have plenty of affection for the Anglican tradition. And I would, in some ways, I think of myself as like a credo Anglican rather than a Reformed Baptist, but
Mhm.
that's not a thing. So the only one as far as I know.
Yeah.
But the point I'm coming around to is, having experienced a couple of different denominations. I'm in a Presbyterian church now, and having seen how an Anglican church was governed, it was just so much faster to make decisions and do things because there's someone in charge. There's an
Mhm.
individual who's actually in charge. Whereas in Presbyterian church where I am now, just there's a committee to form the committee to discuss electing a committee to make a decision.
Yeah.
And it has positive and negative sides. So one thing I saw happen in the Presbyterian church I was in was that for a variety of reasons, the staff basically all quit. Uh, this is in the like pastoral stuff, and it wasn't for any terrible reason. They all just, one got a job offer somewhere else, and the other one was sort of burning out and needed to do something else for a while, look after his family, and just, there was no like a blow up, so someone had an affair or anything like that. They're just in the space of 6 months. The pastoral staff are all gone, and we didn't miss a beat. Everything just ticked over. The church kept going. The presbytery had a system in place for this, and we formed a roster of like a couple of people in the church who were sort of able to preach, and had a couple of other pastors from local churches come and cover the pulpit. You'd hardly know anything was going wrong. Where I think there are certain, like particularly kind of congregational Baptist churches, where if that happened, the church would just stop.
Yeah. Fall
3 weeks
apart pretty
later, the whole
quickly.
thing would be over. Everyone would have gone to new churches and found somewhere else that just couldn't keep it running that long. So it just that's the value, I think, of having that really slow to turn ship, is that it doesn't freak out when there's bumps in the road. But the difficulty is that it's hard to get things done. And I think that's a really interesting, I think, little microcosm of what happens at a national scale. There's pros and cons to having a monarch in charge, and there's pros and cons to having parliament. But on balance, I think there are probably more pros to having a monarch.
Yeah. So I think there's no such thing as perfect government. They're all going to have drawbacks and positives.
You can have a David, but you can have an Ahab.
Yes. And then you can have a Jehu who threshes the floor of Jezreel with the blood of Jezebel.
Yeah,
So God can pretty quickly turn that all around as well, which is great. And I think that's to the point, right? Because why did Ahab arise? Is because of the spiritual and moral decay of that society, which caused Elijah to pray and fast for 3.5 years. There was no rain on the earth, and so God had to bring the nation to a state of ruin before there was governmental change. And I think it was Calvin who said, "You get the leaders you deserve," and I
hmm
certainly think that becomes very evident when you have just really wicked people in charge. It's more of a condition of the state. It's like if you walk into a church and there's a female pastor, a female elder, it says more about the congregation than the actual person standing
yeah,
up there. I think it's the same with government. When you have an evil king, it means that there's rot somewhere in the kingdom and that needs to be taken out. So the kind of more sovereign side of me says, well, if there's an evil king arises, then it's for a reason. It means there needs to be national repentance, and it makes that very easier. Another point that Robert Filmer of Patriarcha brings up is that the idea that kings are elected by God, not by the people. And he goes Josiah as an example. Like, who would have thought that Josiah as a child would have been a righteous king? No one in their right mind would elect a child, but he turned out to be one of Israel's greatest kings.
Yeah.
So I think there's a way that appears right to a man, but in the end leads to death. And I think we, in our kind of limited human perceptions, can say, "Oh, this is good government," or "that bad is government," but it really comes down, what does the scripture say? And what I see kind of very clearly is that the Bible seems to argue for monarchy, and I think we have similar eschatology, and I kind of see this when Christ returns. He establishes a monarchy, and he delegates cities to monarchs. So there seems to be, when Christ returns, a restoration of monarchy. Hence why he returns on a horse with a name inscribed King of Kings. He's coming back to establish the monarchy, which has been desecrated through secular societies.
Yeah, I honestly haven't thought it through that deeply, but it's very plausible. That sounds quite possible to me.
So one thing in your book is that you put a large emphasis on the period of the judges, and you sort of look to this as being a system of government that you find preferable. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you call this anarchy, and kind of biblical principles applied um, properly. Well,
Yeah.
I think that I would have a disagreement with that, and if you feel to kind of push back. But I kind of see the judges as a time that actually argues for monarchy, because the kind of expression that's constantly brought up in the judges, everyone was doing right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. There was no king to mediate. I do know that God is king, but I think God always had a plan to establish a human monarch, and we see this with David. He does establish David and then maintains his lineage all the way up to Christ. So I kind of see the judges as a time of, it's like the Wild West, West, and I don't know if it's prescriptive more so than it is descriptive of just the kind of cycles of you know wickedness and restoration that we see even to this day, I suppose.
Yeah. Yes, I think the period of the judges is really interesting, and for the reason you said, that clearly the testimony of the book of Judges is that this was not a good time. This was not ideal. Something needed to change, and so there's that constant refrain: "Oh, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king." And yet there were periods in the book of Judges where things went well for a while. So it's not that it was all doom and gloom.
Hmm.
But I think the big clincher for me is that when Israel then comes to Samuel and says, "We want a king like the nations around us," God tells Samuel, "No, terrible idea. Tell them it's a bad idea. They don't know what they're asking for. They're not going to like it when they get it." And so I think there's this tension where the period of the judges is something that was was better than the alternative, but still not good enough. So I think God is kind of giving them what they ask, but ultimately showing them that both systems, having a king, not having a king, it kind of didn't matter. Stuff went wrong either way, because really fundamentally what they needed was for God to be their king.
Hmm.
And he resolves that tension by the incarnation, and Christ has humanity. And so he is a human king, but he's also God being king at the same time. And that was the real ultimate answer. And so when I look at the book of Judges and I think that's a system I would like to see tried again, it's not because I think it absolutely went swimmingly in Judges. It's just because I think the testimony of particularly 1 Samuel is it's the lesser evil of the two systems. Ultimately, you want just Christ to be king. That's the
Hmm.
real answer. But
Yeah.
as kind of a second choice, the system of the judges was preferable to having the king.
Yeah, or atheistic secularism, which is
Yeah,
leading the West to ruin and despair.
it was still a kind of it was a highly religious society. Like there is a sense in which God was king in the period of the judges. Like I call it anarchy, and even that I think is a bit of a misnomer. I think that's just the closest common label. Technically, I think it was what's called a minarchy. Like there was this rulership from the temple. There was this sense in
Hmm.
which there was a highest court of final appeal at the temple. And because there's that one centralized point, yeah, okay, technically it's not total decentralized anarchy, but it's very close. There is zero taxes. The taxes do not support the military. There's not tax supported courts or police. But normally, when people say they're a minarchist, those are usually just the very few things. They just want, kind of law and order and military defense. Have those things handled by the government through taxes, and everything else is private. That's typically when someone calls themselves a minarchist, that's what they mean. And yet, Israel in the period of the judges was even less government than that. So I think it's closer to being anarchy than minarchy, I think, and yet it's still not
Okay.
absolute. There is that one little point of that quarterfinal appeal, but otherwise the judges are decentralized. So if you don't trust one of the judges to render a fair verdict, you can take your case to a different judge. That's getting very close to kind of this Rothbardian, like Hans Hermann Hoppe idea of having a private law society. But that's getting into the weeds of kind of libertarian theory and what a libertarian society without the state would look like. But part of it is a decentralized court system where people have contracts where they've agreed in advance what private courts they will go to arbitrate their disputes. And like it sounds crazy. Like how could we have a decentralized court system? Don't we kind of have to have one set of laws imposed on everyone? Otherwise, it's chaos. And they kind of paint a picture of, well, no, that actually wouldn't be chaos because here's how we actually do some of these things now. People just don't think about it. And so it's really fascinating stuff to get into. I talk about some of that a bit in the book.
Mm.
But the period of Judges, I think, was kind of a point where I saw in the scriptures, this actually has been done. So Rothbard and Hoppe, I think they're not Christians; they're just sort of theorizing this as political philosophers out of their own mind. And I'm suddenly realizing, this idea they come up with, it's not new. This was done in the time of the Judges, and they got along for centuries. It didn't completely implode. Um, just kind of went, well, when God says, yeah, you don't want a king because he'll tax you, the judges don't do that. He meant it. I want to take God at his word there and say, yeah, it was actually better for a society particularly for a society that worshipped the true God, the one true living God. For a society like that, it was better for them to have decentralized governance.
When I think of taxes, would you not agree that the time of judges also had taxes in terms of offerings the Levites? I know Numbers 18 it discusses first fruits, and ideas in Leviticus 23 of not hedging the edges of your field, leaving them for the destitute and poor, which is a form of tax. You can't reap your entire field. So would you call that tax, or would you call that something else? I would tend to kind of call that a tax.
Yeah, yes and no. It's very nuanced in that particular case because so the title of the book is Taxation Slavery, and that's very deliberate. That's not just to be provocative. It's actually what I'm trying to get at there is I think everywhere in the Bible, Old and New Testament, wherever the issue of taxes comes up, it turns out to be understood in terms of a slavery relationship. So that the people are the king's slaves. That's why they pay him tribute, because they're slaves. And that's actually the same reason that God gives for why the Israelites pay, a tax at the temple is because they are the Lord's slaves. That's actually the language that he uses. And it's the same reason he gives for why they won't be sold in slavery to one another. So an Israelite can't take another Israelite as a slave forever. It can be a temporary arrangement that ends at the Jubilee year, but it can't be perpetual. And he says the reason it can't be perpetual is because ultimately you are my slaves.
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent part of your book that I've never thought about. That was really illuminating kind of that contrast between conquest slavery and contractual slavery,
Mm.
because you do see these terms being used differently in the scriptures. I thought that was quite interesting, in terms of your book highlighting that.
Yeah, critical distinction to make too. I should probably say that up front. I make this distinction in the book between contract and conquest slavery. So contract is where you voluntarily enter into some kind of arrangement where you're working for someone else, maybe to pay off a debt or an exchange for something, for whatever reason, you just think that's the best situation for you. Whereas conquest slavery is obviously someone comes in and points a sword at you and says, "You work in my fields now." It's
Hmm.
there's no voluntary aspect to it at all. So I think there are taxes in the period of the judges in the sense that people pay tribute to God because the Israelites are the Lord's slaves and they pay tribute at the temple. But the judges, the human judges, they don't exact any taxes.
Okay,
So they adjudicate disputes and they lead the people into battle when that's necessary, but they don't take any involuntary money.
unless you're Samuel's. sons take bribes
Yeah, but I
to
mean,
enact justice. Yeah,
a bribe is in a sense a voluntary transaction.
yeah,
It's not a good thing, but it's it is voluntary.
yeah, yeah. No, I said that more tongue in cheek. Yeah, so I think it's important you kind of make this distinction in terms of paying taxes, either done through conquest or contract. But I actually think there's a third way people pay taxes that maybe you haven't considered,
Yeah.
is that people pay taxes as a means of honor. So there's an element where you can pay tax voluntarily and not receive any benefit. So an
Mm,
example, I think a lot of Christians do it this way, where they aren't paying taxes because they think their taxes are going to be stewarded well. I think they pay taxes because they are trying to honor the government and honor God by honoring the government. So I think that's where a lot of Christians fall into that camp. Well, you know, I don't really agree with this tax, but I'm going to honor God. Everything belongs to God anyway. So I'm just
mm,
going to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and focus on the things that belong to God. And ultimately, God's going to judge Caesar and ask him, how have you stewarded the resources that you've received from my people? And it's going to be terrifying for them on the day of judgment. So I think if they ever do like a part two, I'd love to see, or like a second edition, I'd love to see an element on the idea of tax as honor, because we're told in Peter and elsewhere to honor the king. I think Romans 13 even taps into this idea of honoring those in authority, and they were pagan heretics and crazy people at the time, and he's still saying honor them. So I think that's probably another element where yes, you have the idea of conquest, contract, but I also think there's just an element where you honor those in authority. Is that something that you had thought about or considered?
uh, I think it is, but I probably frame it a little differently. Um, so I think people, I don't think very many people pay taxes because they really, really like the king. Uh, Maybe there are some people who do, but I'm not even sure if I'd call that tax. They could make those contributions outside of the tax system. They could present that to the king as a gift. If enough people in the society really liked the king and the way he did things, it could actually be a zero tax society, but there's still revenue. And so, like one of the memes that gets thrown around sometimes, I think is helpful to just kind of frame the thinking is, let's just turn all the government projects into GoFundMe campaigns.
Yeah.
All the things that we actually want done, that people really want the government to do, they will fund. They will voluntarily fund them.
Hmm.
Just an example might be, look, just we want there to be like a welfare safety net for people who are born blind and deaf. It's pretty hard to argue with that. That seems like a thing that should exist in a compassionate society. And it's one of those things that I think if there was absolutely zero taxes, you'd have no trouble raising the funds to make sure that people in that horrible situation were looked after. Charities have no problem raising money for those kind of extreme cases. And then obviously there's a lot of shades of grey up to the point where there are charities that are raising money for things that are honestly a bit frivolous. But there's every shade in between. And the wonderful thing about imagine if all of our social programs were funded purely voluntarily, is that it would give the market the chance to differentiate between things that were worth funding and things that weren't, and it would give people a chance to weed out corruption because if you want to raise funds for some social program that you want to run as like a non-profit, you've you've got to have the donors convinced that you are spending the money well. And if you're embezzling half the money, eventually it will come out and the funding will immediately stop. People will go and give it to someone else who's actually doing what they're meant to be doing. Uh, where you don't have that option when it's taken from you against your will. So I would like to see a society where all of those things are funded voluntarily. And I think at that point, you might still have a king. Exactly what the boundaries of the king's powers is up for discussion, but you might still have some kind of head of state, figurehead type person who a lot of those funds are channeled through and that people respect. But I wouldn't call it tax at that point. I would call it gifts.
Hmm. Well, I think that's exactly it, because a king can't micromanage a nation. There's no
Yeah.
possible way that all these little decisions can go through. So he's going to kind of let the nation do its thing and take care of the kind of big issues. I think one of the things that Hobbes and Fulmer argue is that the reason you need a king is that you need an ultimatum in which disputes can be settled. So if something, and you see this with Solomon, right? Solomon, there's these two prostitutes, and like everyone's kind of bewildered about this problem. Like, how do we know who's this child? And he's kind of demonstrates his wisdom and his right as king to be able to discern and be that kind of final arbitrator in this kind of very tricky situation.
Mm,
And then the taxes in this kind of paradigm is contractual, as what you said, because you're not just giving money to the king so that he can, live in a palace and, travel the world, shake hands at, G3 summits. You're paying taxes because he has an obligation to protect the nation from outside invaders, protect your property, and to ensure that commerce happens. So really the purpose of the king is to protect the nation from invaders and to stop people from avenging themselves. That's really the goal of the king, according to Hobbes and Filmer, which I think falls with biblical principles because we see this kind of just two characteristics of the government in the scriptures, which is a terror to evil works through the drawing of the sword, and then to promote that which is good. So I think you kind of that's wrapped up in that kind of small government mentality, which can only be maintained if you have a righteous population. And I think this is
yeah,
why in Proverbs it says, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is reproach to the people. Because of the transgression of the land, many are its princes." And I think when you have people who are breaking the rules, then that there's a need for more and more princes, more and more delegation, to the point, as you've rightly said, now we're at a point where we're probably breaking the law at any point of the day because there's so many laws that they could, throw us in prison at the drop of a hat. And I think this is the kind of Stalinist idea: show me the man, I'll show you the crime he's committed. And we
yeah.
really live in societies now where you could really be thrown into prison for any, if they don't like you, basically, they throw you into prison. So, uh, yeah, I think there's massive advantages to monarchy, and I think we're in agreement that we would rather have Christian government over whatever we have right now, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call what we have right now.
I think it's true, and I think the more that you have kind of uh, a Christian society broadly, the less necessary it becomes to eliminate, to technically eliminate everything that's the state, because the better people who are in that position in the state and the government, the better they're behaving, the less necessary it is to remove them. If they're, most of the time stewarding funds well, it's not as critical to replace them, with something more voluntary that the market can discipline. There are societies where maybe it seems like there's a lot of rules, but just if people are governing well, it's not that necessary to fix the system and change the incentives. And so the more that people in general are, looking to Christ and living in faith and repentance, the less necessary it's going to be to fix the structure of the government. I think the details of, whether it's a monarchy or a parliament, or exactly how succession of the monarchy is handled, or these are all details that I think are just not that important compared to are people trying to govern in line with with the law of God. That's, I would say, is part of the natural law, and part of what's biblical. And are they looking to the scriptures and seeing what God has revealed is right and wrong and trying to govern according to that? Now, there are certain considerations. I don't think you could have like a totally centrally planned economy and have that be governed biblically. It can't be done even in principle. This is kind of one of Mises' great insights, is that there's something called the calculation problem, that if the government actually owns all the means of production, everything will grind to a halt because they won't be able to accurately predict what is going to be needed by people because there's no price system. The only way that enough information can circulate in the economy to do things efficiently is if there are prices that go up and down to indicate people's changing demand and the changes in technology that shift what people are needing to build. Uh, if everything's owned by the government, there's no real price system. The information doesn't travel, and things get done wildly inefficiently. And this was part of the downfall of the Soviet Union. So there are limits to what kind of governmental system you can have. Some things are just not functional, even if they're run by perfect angels. Uh, and by the same token, I think there are certain governmental systems that incentivize good behavior, even when terrible people are in power. So I think it's better to be in a society where, like, if you've got to have a wicked ruler, it's better if it's a system where the ruler has a lot less power.
Yeah, and I think you see this a lot of the kind of modern tyranny comes out of secular or atheist presuppositions where they believe the human condition is perfectible through some type of government or perfectible through technology. Whilst as Christians, the Christian paradigm, well, man's fallen, and we live in this cursed world, and it will only be perfectible when Christ returns and creates a new heavens and new earth and resurrects our fleshly bodies and gives us, human 2.0 patch update to humanity. Yeah, and I think wisdom's justified by her children. Like
It's terrible.
as I said earlier, I think England is a case study to the application of Christian principles on a nation and what it leads to. Now, obviously, not everything that came out of the British Empire was hunky dory, and there was obviously evil people. And I really think the rise of Darwinism, which is kind of the rejection of Christian principles, is when things really start to turn in the kingdom. But a lot of good came out of it. The reason we're speaking English right now, and then I can talk to you across the world, and we have this common language, is because of the British Empire. And this was really spurred on, but with a nationalistic zeal to reach the nations with the gospel and with Christianity. Of course, there's obviously business ventures as well that was certainly leveraged, but there was also a sincere desire to see the nations reached for Christ. And this is why they taught the native population English and how to read and built roads and built infrastructure and had libraries and these types of things. So yes, there was an element of colonialism being bad, but I actually think there's an element of colonialism being quite fruitful and useful to a lot of the nations in which it impacted.
You ever heard of Richard Johnson?
Rings a bell, but no, I haven't.
He was the chaplain, the Church of England chaplain that came out to Australia on what we call the First Fleet. So the very first big group of boats that came here, and he was sent as the chaplain, but also as a missionary to try and bring the gospel to what they would call the natives, that we would now call Aboriginal Indigenous Australians or whatever. It's the most recent PC label. It changes about every 10, 20 years.
Okay.
Uh, but he was handpicked, as I understand it, by Wilberforce to
Interesting.
come out and be the person to come connect here. And he came here and had children, and he gave them all Aboriginal names
Interesting.
rather than English names, which I don't know an awful lot more about him, but I just hearing that couple of things makes me go, yeah, okay, he had a heart for the people here, and I think particularly giving his children those names, I think is a very strong indication of him. I don't think you could possibly accuse him of being a racist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like he clearly wanted to love these people and get to know them and connect with their culture and build a bridge there. He wanted to be a bridge builder and not separator. And it's one of those details of Australian history that we don't get taught in school, but I think is really significant and tells you something about what the actual culture of the British Empire was at that time. That it was not all bad. The story that we're taught in school is just these evil white British people showed up and shot everyone and took whatever they wanted for themselves and
Raped and
raped and
pillaged.
pillaged, and that was
Yeah.
that. And
Well, I think that's
once again,
intentional.
that's
If I'm going to be honest, the
mm,
the the kind of censorship of the Christian origins of the British Empire, I think it's deliberately kept from people. And I even think a lot of this DEI stuff is really just anti-Anglo stuff. And I think the reason is it kind of follows through this, because if you follow the path, well, what made England great? You're going to land up with Christianity. So it's a subtle way of discriminating against Christianity. I don't know if have even the national anthem in Britain is censored. I don't know if you know this, but they
I
only
don't know.
sing the first and the last verse of the national anthem. And if you read the full national anthem, it's explicitly Christian. So we just, I can read a couple of verses here, and you can understand why they don't
Oh, yeah,
sing this. Um,
lay it on me.
First of all, God save the king, God save the queen is a biblical principle. It's a cry that God would regenerate, make this king monarch Christian,
Mm,
so that they can enact righteousness on the land. So we have God save the king. So this is the one that they censor, right? O Lord our God, arise, scatter our enemies, and make them fall. Confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. On thee our hopes we rest. God save us all. And if there's not a stanza that's more applicable to the UK today, it's that verse. So the nation needs to sing that again. Come and destroy the enemies of Christ. Come and bring in righteousness. God save us, because there's no kind of human solution to the problems in the UK. And this isn't very politically correct, because it's a condemnation of Islam, which is exalted
mm,
as the state religion in the UK, the protected sacred cow that you cannot criticize. and it's a call for the destruction of Islam and the influence of England. So there's a reason why they don't sing it, but and that goes on. So if anyone, I encourage people to actually look up the full all the lyrics to the British national anthem. It's explicitly Christian. It's explicitly communicating the kind of sovereignty of Christ upon all nations. Actually, I will sing one more because it kind of ties into what we're saying. It goes on and says, "Not in this land alone, but be God's mercies known from shore to shore. Lord, make the nation see that men should brothers be, and from one family the wide world over." So again, this idea of, I would say, true globalism, where yes, we are one big family and in Christ, and that from one man God created all the nations of the earth, and that was the scriptures used by Wilberforce, right? It was to end slavery. Why? Because this slave's my brother. This we're the same blood, we're the same family technically, and that comes from biblical principles. Well, there's a fascinating book called After the Flood by a guy called William Cooper,
I've read it.
and he, oh,
Obscure book, but
wonderful.
I have read it, and it was fascinating. I think I read the whole thing in 2 days. Couldn't put it down.
Yeah. Well,
So,
he obviously traces the genealogies of, I think it's 5 European nations back to Noah.
mm,
So these were records that were kept. And, we're currently as a family going through Genesis, and there's all these genealogies, and just telling the kids, well, why are there these genealogies? Well, one is to show that the Bible is actually a book of history. You don't include genealogies and, parables or fairy tales to tell moral tales. It's history. And the second one is to work out kings, because you see Matthew opens with a genealogy, and it's to show that Jesus is the one born King of the Jews, which is what the Magi come to Herod and say. So it's important that those records were kept, and it proves that the Bible history is true. Jesus said, "If I tell you of earthly things, you don't believe me. How will you believe of heavenly things?" I feel like there's people who throw out the historical roots of Christianity and wonder why Christianity has no relevance in society. Well, because you've kind of chopped it off at the roots.
mm, it's very true, and I found it so grounding to kind of read these genealogies and go, okay, we're Japhethites. That's where we derive from. We actually like you got to go a fair way back. We're a bit on the edge of the story compared to obviously the sort of Semitic peoples and this thing, but we're in there. We can plug our history into here's where we are in the Bible, and that was a really odd sensation to realize that, okay, it feels so much closer to home once I realized, like, oh, my great 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 grandparents, like that's where they are. So I feel like,
Yeah, well, you have people throwing around the term anti-Semitic now,
mm,
and I don't think most of the people even know what a Semite is.
yeah,
What is a Semite? It's a descendant of Shem.
mm,
And who's Shem? He's the descendant of Noah. So what? You believe the Bible now? You believe that Noah got on the ark with all the animals? Like, is it convenient for you now to believe in the Bible, the biblical history? So it's crazy they believe that we all came from Africa. Yet, according to them, according to evolution, Shem didn't exist, and there was no. It's just a fairy tale.
mm.
So how come now there's Shemites, and how can you now be anti-Semitic? It's a bit
Yeah,
wild.
where do the records stop being
And
true? It's
so, Nick, we've covered a lot of ground. One thing we haven't tapped on is the concept of Monero,
mm,
and how does this play into Christian governance, and maybe just how did you get into Monero, and do you still see it as a viable option for for Christians to use?
yeah, I mean, I say it's extremely viable. I You sent me a previous podcast that you'd done recently. I listened through that, and I agreed with a lot of the things you guys had to say about Monero. I think it's a fantastic tool for funding missionaries in the field and things like this. I think all the stuff you guys said about if you want to not let your left hand know what your right hand's doing, if you want your giving to be secret, Monero is great for that. Just privacy in cryptocurrency in general is a great thing, and I think just it is what it is. Monero is, I think, head of the pack there. I think the technology is great. It's not perfect. There's room for improvement. Full chain membership proofs on the horizon, and I'm very optimistic about how that's going to go. I think Monero is just a very useful tool. I think to steal a line, I think from Roger Ver, he says, go out, try a bunch of cryptocurrencies, and use whichever one's most useful to you in your life. And I have tended to find it's been Monero. Given the choice, a couple of people have bought a copy of my book for Monero, and I haven't
Oh,
said that.
cool.
I'll
Then you could do that.
I'll basically say, like, I'll take whatever cryptocurrency you want to give me, just out of almost curiosity to try out what other people are into. But in practice, I find what people want to use is Monero. Um, occasionally people want to try Bitcoin, but just for something the size of a book, the transaction fees and things, it just doesn't make as much sense. I had one guy that wanted to mail me silver coins, uh, but that was like from New Zealand internationally. I thought that's just not cost effective.
Okay.
I think I just mailed him a
Yeah.
book in the end and said, "Don't just have one." Uh, yeah, in practice, I find Monero is what people are using, um, which is interesting because it's not the most convenient because of some of the privacy
Mhm.
stuff. It just takes some time for coins to be unlocked and that sort of thing.
Synchronization.
Um, so I've used currencies like Nano that are instant and feeless, and it's super super convenient. But the privacy is just not up to the standard of Monero. It just is what it is. And what I'm finding in practice is that people want to use, like, I don't know if it's a branding thing, but the the libertarian types that I tend to roll with, they want to use Monero or Bitcoin. Uh, I'm not a big fan of BTC Bitcoin for all the a lot of the standard big blocker reasons. Something I'm hoping to eventually do in the future is just a series of probably kind of whiteboard videos explaining all the technical reasons why I think BTC is kind of a dead end technologically, or just even mathematically. Why it can't be freedom money for the world for a few different reasons. I think become it's going to suffer from the same problems that gold had, where we got fractional reserves and money printing on top of the gold standard. I think the same thing is going to happen on a Bitcoin standard.
Mhm.
Um, but that's very controversial take over.
In some circles, yeah, I think in the Monero community, most would agree with that thesis. And people who maybe haven't been conditioned to kind of or have a financial incentive to keep Bitcoin strong, people who are more neutral, I think would see your point of view far clearer than the Bitcoin bros.
Yeah, it's true that there is a lot of degenerate gambling in the sort of altcoin space, and there's not really any good label that's taken root to label a group of coins that are not for degenerate gambling, but are not necessarily Bitcoin. There's What's taken root is there's Bitcoin and there's crypto. I think that's a terrible way to categorize it, but that is
Hmm.
what's sort of taking effect as a meme. I think Monero is a very, very effective tool for freedom money. Are you familiar at all with the idea of agorism? Agorism is a particular take on kind of anarcho-capitalism, but the big differentiating thing is what's called counter economics. So it's how do we get to a free society with less oppression, less less violence, less coercion? How do we get there? Is by using the market, is by using economics instead of politics. So instead of trying to get someone elected and vote for things and do all the cloak and dagger backstabbing political games, don't do any of that. Instead, start a business and conduct it in a way that leads to more freedom. So I think the example I like to give people, because I think it's a good one, is Uber. So there was this kind of state monopoly on you had to pay some obscene amount, $100,000 or something, for a medallion for like a license to have a taxi. And so it's really hard to get into the taxi game, super expensive, which drives the cost of taxis up. And then Uber comes in and has this app, and you can book a car and take a ride, and it's cheaper because they don't have to cover the license fees. There's no medallions, and eventually they kind of got it done so fast that the legal system just had not caught up with it. And eventually they tried to say, hey, like, this is a taxi service, you guys need to pay the fees. But by then it was too far gone. It was too spread out. People were using it and liked it, and it was just politically not viable to crack down on it. And I think that is the way. That, I think, is a more effective way to change things for the better in the society, is just to use the market rather than trying to get people elected. Because once they're elected, they're subjected to all the same negative incentives. They're incentivized to do the wrong thing, to do the things the way they've always been done, the way they're currently being done. So the market is a better way to change society. That is the idea of agorism, and I think Monero is a fantastic tool for that. It gives people the chance to do business with each other on what some might call the black market, and that's a fair term, but it's really the free market. So it's yes, it would let someone buy drugs and not get caught, but it would also let someone smuggle Bibles into Dubai. It works both ways. It lets people smuggle food into Venezuela and Bibles into Dubai and fund all those kind of activities. And I think we need a way for a lot of economic activity to happen that's beyond the reach of the violent state. And I think Monero is the tool for that job. It's the head and shoulders above the rest tool for that job.
So, Nick, we've covered a lot of ground recently. Why don't you tell people how they can contact you or what projects you are currently working on?
The big thing I'm working on at the moment that's keeping me from working on other things is called Indie Pro. So I have a business partner in the US who's also a Christian, and basically what we're working on is a software platform for people who do some kind of typically white collar job. If you're the kind of person that can do your job from a laptop, and if you're interested in working for yourself instead of working for someone else, we think one of the best things we can do for the society is get a lot more people to be able to work for themselves. That just opens up a lot more personal freedom, a lot less worry about being cancelled for saying the wrong thing, about falling foul of the law. You have a lot more flexibility, a lot more scope to live a quiet, peaceful, and godly life and not be bothered. So that's something we're working on. It's just a platform for people who are used to working as an employee to give them a way to go solo and work as a freelancer. Uh, if you're interested in that, it's currently you know pre-launch. We're still building it, but you can go to getindiepro.com and put your email in, and we'll let you know if you're interested in that. It's yeah, that's my current big project.